The Qatar Grand Prix is over and Max Verstappen takes victory in what had to be one of the trickiest races of the year as drivers were pushed to their physical limits, and in this video we are going to be taking a look at the data and do a data analysis from the Qatar Grand Prix. Now let's get into the video. As usual, I'll be talking about McLaren, Aston Martin, Ferrari, Mercedes and Red Bull later on, so stick around for that. The race in Qatar was unlike anything else that we have seen in F1 since the refueling era. The drivers were forced into a scenario where every single lap was essentially a qualifying lap due to the restrictions put in place by Pirelli for the Grand Prix. Due to damage sustained to the drivers' tyres, the drivers were limited to only completing a total of 18 laps on each set of tyres, and this meant that we saw a 3-stop race with a couple of drivers being forced into doing a 4-stop race. However, unlike early on in the Pirelli era, where this was because the tyres were designed to degrade, this was because the tyre structure could not take the extremes of the circuit, and not because of tyre wear, and this meant that the drivers were able to push every single lap of the Grand Prix. To show this off, I have the lap times of Max Verstappen from the race, and what can we see here? Well, what we can see is that the times just progressively get faster and faster and faster. Usually when we see a 3-stop race, the lap times only get faster for a couple of laps on each stint before the tyre wear kicks in, and then times start to get slower and slower before they box for a fresh set of tyres. And when on the fresh tyres, all of a sudden they find a boatload of time. This was not really the case this weekend, and instead, the drivers were able to set their fastest laps on each tyre just before pitting for another set, just to go and repeat the same thing again and again. Because of this, Verstappen was able to set a fastest lap time that was just over half a second off his pole position lap time, which is really not something that we see very often, unless qualifying is wet, or unless a driver pits before the end of the race with just a few laps to go set a fastest lap. So with that in mind then, let's take a look at the pole position lap time and compare it to his fastest lap from the Grand Prix. In blue is his fastest lap from the Grand Prix, and in white is the qualifying pole lap. And what can we see here? Well, actually, for the first half of the lap, Verstappen is actually able to match, and in some instances, beat his qualifying lap in the Grand Prix, which just goes to show how relentless the pace of the race was. Remember, this was on lap 56 into what was a pretty grueling Grand Prix. It was not until the fast triple apex towards the end of the lap where the advantage of the soft tyres from qualifying gave Max Verstappen that edge over the race fastest lap. There you can see he can just carry way more speed at that point, and at that point he was absolutely on the limit. Usually the fastest lap is around 2 to 3 seconds off of the qualifying pole lap, but like I said, in this instance, it was only half a second. As mentioned, there was a lot of pit stops during the Qatar Grand Prix, and that can be seen by this chart here provided by Pirelli. The number of pit stops during the race was 54. As I mentioned earlier, the majority of drivers did a 3-stop and a couple did do a 4-stop. Of the tyres that were used, the majority used the medium tyres as often as they possibly could. The soft tyres were used by a couple of drivers, but the softs were not really a strong tyre in this race. Much like in the sprint, they were only good for a few laps before the pace really started to drop off. In the midfield, this race, with its different set of rules, led to a very different running order as well. One team in the midfield that benefited massively was Alfa Romeo, as both Valtteri Bottas and Zhou Guanyu finished the race in the points and scored a much needed 6 points for Alfa Romeo, as they now move to 8th place in the Constructors' Championship and overtake Haas. When you look at the times in the race from Bottas, Albon and Kevin Magnussen in the Haas, you can see that Bottas had decent pace and took advantage of the very early safety car to get off the soft compound tyres. This, and having 2 sets of the hard tyres, really helped Bottas to maximise the pace of his car and not worry about any performance drop-off that there potentially could have been from the tyres. For Alfa Romeo, this performance may have been a bit of a one-off, but it was fantastic to see that when the conditions are tricky, they are in a good position to score well. We kind of saw something like this in Spa as well during qualifying. I just want to say that if you are enjoying the video, then I would really appreciate it if you hit the like button and subscribe for more F1 content. I'm on my way to 5k subs, and I would really appreciate it if you help me get there. I've also launched a Patreon, and you can check that out in the link below. Now though, let's get back to the video and let's talk about the top 5 teams, and let's start with McLaren. For McLaren, the Qatar weekend was an incredible result. Firstly, Oscar Piastri winning the sprint race and beating Max Verstappen on pace was a brilliant achievement, especially when you take into consideration where McLaren were at the start of the year. In the race as well, McLaren had fantastic pace and were once again the closest rivals to Red Bull. You can see that with the data provided by Formula Data Analysis as well, that actually overall, one of the McLaren drivers did have better pace than Verstappen, and when you compare the overall times of Piastri and Verstappen, you can see how Piastri actually had better pace in quite a few areas. The biggest issue for Piastri was the first pit stop. He boxed pretty early and came out into traffic. This traffic essentially meant that Verstappen was able to build up a gap due to the power of the overcut this weekend. Rather surprisingly on the hard tyre though, Piastri had better pace than Verstappen, and if the 18 lap limit was not enforced, then it would have been pretty interesting to see how the race could have panned out. This is all despite the fact that Piastri still has worse race pace than his teammates, although that gap is slowly coming down. But to show that, I have the lap times of Norris and Piastri. Oscar is definitely getting closer to Norris in terms of race pace, but he is still lacking just a little bit. But in time he will definitely get there. It is looking more and more likely now that Red Bull's closest rival in 2024 will be the McLaren team, and who knows, a Grand Prix victory could be just around the corner for them. For Aston Martin, the Qatar race was not really a bad performance at all. Alonso finished the race in 6th place, however an error by the Spanish driver cost him what could have been, and probably should have been, a 4th place finish, which for Aston Martin at this point of the season would have been a fantastic result. But how did his pace compare to teammate Lance Stroll, who finished just outside the points in P11? Well, you can see that Stroll's pace was a lot more all over the place when compared to Alonso, and sadly for Stroll, this was somewhat to be expected due to him once again having to come through the field after a tricky qualifying session. On the laps where it looks like Stroll was not stuck in traffic, however, his pace was not too bad when compared to Fernando, and Lance can take some confidence away from that. For Aston Martin, they are now only 11 points ahead of McLaren, and with the current rate of progress between the two teams, it's looking very likely that Aston Martin will not finish in 4th place in the Constructors' Championship, despite the fact that early on, they were quite comfortably the 2nd fastest team. For Ferrari, the Qatar Grand Prix was not a strong race when compared to previous races. They were slower than McLaren, Mercedes, and were similar in pace to Fernando Alonso in the Aston Martin. Carlos Sainz was unable to take part in the race due to a fuel leak, meaning that it all came down to Charles Leclerc. So let's take a look at the times and compare it to Fernando Alonso in the Aston Martin and also Oscar Piastri in the McLaren. And what can we see here? Well, what we can see for Ferrari is pretty grim viewing for Charles Leclerc on the medium tyres, as he doesn't have very good pace and it's actually very comparable to Fernando Alonso. On the hard tyre, Leclerc does actually look a little bit stronger, however when compared to Piastri in the McLaren, the pace is nowhere near, and for Ferrari this is not a great sign. For a few races after the summer break, it was looking like Ferrari had become the 2nd fastest team, and they were closing into Red Bull. However, since Japan, McLaren seemed to be the team that has made the moves forward. Ferrari were also slower than Mercedes this weekend, which will not help them in their quest for 2nd place in the Constructors' Championship. And in some ways, had Sainz not been dealing with unfortunate issues such as a fuel leak, then Ferrari could have closed the gap to Mercedes given Hamilton took himself out at the beginning of the race, but thankfully for them, Sainz was unable to start. And speaking of Mercedes, the Qatar race was always going to be a tricky one, despite the fact that they had really good pace. And the reason for this is Mercedes had used their medium tyres more than their rivals, and there was always a feeling that they would need to use the soft tyres, and for Lewis Hamilton, he opted to use the soft tyres and get it out the way at the beginning of the race, and initially that sounded like a good strategy, right up until he came across Russell and took himself out of the race. Hamilton starting on soft pretty much nailed him onto a 4-stop strategy, but if he got into the lead, then maybe at least Max Verstappen's life could have been made a little bit tricky. Instead though, his teammate was forced onto a 4-stop instead after the contact meant that Russell needed to stop for a fresh set of tyres. And this contact essentially meant that Mercedes threw away a potential podium result because they had great pace. And to show that, I have the pace of Russell in the Mercedes to Piastri in the McLaren. And here, you can see, especially on the hard tyres, Russell had brilliant pace. And this had the feeling of, sadly, a bit of a wasted opportunity for the Silver Arrows team. And finally, for Red Bull, the Qatar Grand Prix was another victory for Max Verstappen. However, things were not as easy as they usually are. Red Bull's biggest advantage is typically tyre wear. Their tyre wear is so strong versus their rivals that as stints wear on, Max is usually able to pull further and further away. But due to how Qatar was, this was not possible, and it meant that he was under threat from Piastri and Norris. For his teammate, however, the pace was just not there, and you can see that when you look at the times of Verstappen and Perez. This was a very poor outing from Perez, and frankly, he was lucky that Hamilton did not survive turn 1, because if he did, then it's likely that Perez's second place in the Drivers' Championship would be under much more increasing threat. But that didn't happen, so Perez is still, thankfully for him, still in second place. Next time out at the United States, Red Bull will be looking to crush the competition, as it looks like a circuit that they should go very well at. So, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, as always, comment, leave a like, and subscribe for more F1 content. Thank you all so much for watching.